Hey there. Before we continue our discussion of English Dissent, I want to tell you a little joke. One day, a Southern Baptist and a General Baptist were talking about what they believe. The Southern Baptist explained that his church believes everything in the Baptist faith and message. And then he asked the other man, "What does your church believe?" The General Baptist answered, "Everything in general and nothing in particular." Ha! I told you it was a little joke, right? Okay. Well, let's move on. The next topic we want to discuss in our story about English Dissent is the next monarch after Elizabeth I. As you know, Elizabeth never married, had no offspring, and so with Elizabeth, the Tudor dynasty came to an end, and James then brought in the Stuart dynasty. James I was connected to Henry VII through his mother and his father. And so he was King of Scotland at the time of Elizabeth's death, James VI in Scotland, but he succeeded Elizabeth and became James I of England because of his descent from Henry VII. Now, because Scotland at this time was a Presbyterian nation, the Puritans hoped that James would be friendly to dissent. And so the Puritans composed what they called a millenary petition, called millenary because it was signed by 1,000 Puritans, and they hoped for concessions. No concessions, but James convened the Hampton Court Conference. And at the conclusion of this conference, he said, "No bishop, no king." He recognized that his kingship, his monarchy, depended upon the support of the bishops of the Church of England. And so he maintained the Church of England as the official state church. He went on to say, "Puritans will conform, or I will harry them out of the land." So it did not look good for the Puritans and other dissenters as James ascended the throne. Now, one good thing to come out of the Hampton Court Conference was the authorization of the King James Version of the Bible. So King James authorized a new translation. There were 50 scholars divided up into 6 groups, and they developed the most accurate English translation at that time, and it became the standard version for English-speaking Protestants. It was first published in 1611, but it was revised several times until 1769, and the 1769 edition is the one still being used today. Now, the translation of the New Testament was based on Erasmus's Greek New Testament published in 1516. Now, you've heard me many times extol the virtues of Erasmus's critical edition of the Greek New Testament, and it was an amazing project and had tremendous influence on early reformers. However, his New Testament was based upon just a half-dozen manuscripts, and the earliest one was from the 10th century, only 600 years before the King James Version. Today, however, we have access to 6,000 1,000 manuscripts, more than 100 times as many. In our earliest manuscripts date back to the 2nd century. We have over 400 manuscripts that are earlier than the earliest manuscripts available to the translators of the King James Version. Now, today, there still are many Christians who insist on the King James Version only, believing that the text of Erasmus's Greek New Testament was inspired, and the translation of the King James Version was inspired, and so they consider it the only authorized version. We need to understand, however, that the modern translations are based on many more manuscripts than were available at that time. Earlier and more reliable manuscripts at that. And so we can be confident that our modern translations are more accurate, but at the same time, we still must appreciate the King James Version, the beauty of its language, as well as the fact that it was a valuable addition to the history of the English Bible. Over 80% of the King James Version was based on William Tyndale's very earliest translation of the Bible. Now, there was tremendous political tension under James I. We've already talked about the hopes and expectations of the Puritans. One reason why they delivered their petition hoping for concessions was that they preferred a simple liturgy over the Book of Common Prayer, which they considered popish, that is to say Roman Catholic in its origin. They wanted pastors who were better preachers. They were critical of the bishops of the Church of England who owned much property. They wanted to discipline the church according to the New Testament, and they wanted a church governed by elders, not by bishops. And so there were tensions from the Puritans, but there were also tensions from the Catholics. The Catholics had hoped for concessions from James also. James's mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a devout Roman Catholic. And so the Catholics hoped that when James became the king, that he would offer concessions to the Catholics, but not so. Therefore, there were a group of Catholics headed by Guy Fawkes who developed the gunpowder plot in 1605 with the intention of blowing up Parliament. Picture Parliament next door to a warehouse, and these two buildings share a common basement. All right, and so the conspirators went into the warehouse, went into the basement, and underneath Parliament they piled barrels of gunpowder with the intention of blowing it up, destroying Parliament, the king, and the lords. Well, the plot was discovered. Guy Fawkes and his conspirators were hung, and today, every November 7th, the English people still celebrate Guy Fawkes Day. They celebrate it with bonfires and fireworks, and it's quite a hubbub. Now, Parliament had two houses, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Commons supported the Puritans, and they opposed James's claim to absolute monarchy. James, therefore, relied upon the House of Lords, and he resisted assembling Parliament for fear that the House of Commons would reduce his authority. When James died, his son, Charles I, became the king, and he attempted to continue his father's absolute monarchy, and he also attempted to rule without the Parliament. He pressed for control over religion, the uniformity of religious practices, and he aligned himself with the episcopacy. Just like his father, he recognized his dependence upon the episcopacy, the bishops, for the support of his monarchy. And so his ally was William Laud, whom he named the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was a rigid episcopal authoritarian. He demanded absolute conformity to the Book of Common Prayer. He held to an Arminian theology as opposed to the Calvinist theology of the Separatists, and he opposed all dissenters, Puritans, Separatists, Presbyterians, Baptists, the Congregationalists, who of course were the Separatists, but he was a very powerful figure in England. Now, enter the Civil War, which brought about tremendous change in England. The Scots invaded, and so Charles was forced to assemble Parliament in order to achieve the taxation that he needed for the finances to support his defense. But Parliament eroded Charles's power, neglecting to raise the taxes until finally civil war erupted. In 1645, Parliament gained enough support to execute Archbishop Laud. The Civil War lasted from 1642 to 1648. Parliament's House of Lords supported the pro-Puritan army. They allied with the Scots, and they ultimately defeated the Royalist army. And so the Civil War defeated Charles and the Royalists and put the Puritans in control. And so from 1648 to 1660, there is no monarchy in England. We call this the Interregnum period. In 1649, Parliament tried and beheaded Charles. And then Oliver Cromwell was elected the Protector in 1653, not taking the title of king, instead being the Protector of England. However, when he died, the Protectorate collapsed because the rule then extended to his son Richard, who was not the leader that his father was. Now, during the Interregnum, English Parliament allied with the Scots, and they called for a Westminster Assembly in Westminster Abbey. And they established the Reformed Church throughout the three kingdoms of the British Isles, England, Scotland, and Ireland. So now the Presbyterians are in control, not the Church of England. And so now the Presbyterians are going to extend religious liberty to their fellow dissenters, right? Wrong. When the Presbyterians found themselves in control, they used their power to suppress other dissenters. And Baptists suffered, even though Baptists had supported the Civil War. All right, and we find this to be true, that whenever a religious entity who has suffered persecution gains the upper hand and power, they do not share religious liberty, but in fact they enact their own persecution and suppression of dissent. Well, in 1660, the Protectorate failed, and so all of the powers in England uh, agreed that it was time to restore the monarchy. And so they asked Charles II, who was the son of Charles I, to return and accept the monarchy again. And so the Presbyterian Church was suppressed again. The Church of England was restored along with the rule of the bishops. Charles II, just like his father and grandfather, he believed in absolute monarchy by divine right. And so the power struggle was renewed between Charles, the church, and Parliament. And so the Clarendon Code was passed. This code, like the Elizabethan settlement, was a series of acts legislated to force dissenters into submission to the Church of England and to the king. So here's a list of the acts that were passed. The Corporation Act required all public officials to take communion in the Church of England. The Uniformity Act insisted that all ministers and teachers of the church had to give full assent to the Book of Common Prayer. And of course, under the union of church and state, their employment was dependent upon the state church. The Conventicle Act prohibited any meeting for worship that did not follow the Book of Common Prayer. And the 5 Mile Act was enacted against dissenting ministers who had been fired and then tried to set up another congregation. No, the 5 Mile Act insisted that any dissenting minister that was fired could not live within 5 miles of his previous congregation. So the Clarendon Code was enacted, as I said, to force all dissenters into submission to the Church of England. Well, persecution was severe during the restoration of the monarchy, but there were some positive as well as negative results of persecution. This severe persecution weeded out nominal dissenters, and so those who remained in these congregations were purified and strengthened spiritually so that they had a strong witness. Persecution forced the dissenters to cooperate with each other, so they had to share ministers and other resources. Dissent made Baptists more respectable. All right, all of a sudden the Presbyterians were not so high and mighty anymore. They were dissenters and persecuted just like the Baptists and the Congregationalists, and so they had more affinity with each other. Now the negative side is that the persecution weakened dissenters. It drained their resources over a long period of time, almost 30 years. And dissenters became more resolved to struggle for religious liberty. At the same time, they were constantly trying to prove their loyalty to the king. And ultimately, the struggle led to a fortress mentality. Simply surviving was a monumental task, almost more than they could do. And so they let other things fall into decline. Now, at the death of Charles II, his brother James II became king. And James II was an avid Catholic, so avid that in his castle he maintained a priest to privately provide Mass for James and his family. And so the rest of the nation was very concerned that James II might follow the lead of Mary Tudor and return England to Catholicism. And so he was opposed by the aristocracy of the Church of England, as well as the Anglican clergy and dissenters and all political figures. So ultimately, everyone in England aligned with each other to depose James. And so they expelled him from England for fear of his Roman Catholic tendencies. And instead, they invited Mary, James's daughter, and her husband, William, who became William III, and they were Queen and King of England. William was the leading defender of Protestantism in Europe, and they brought about what's known as the Glorious Revolution, which ended the persecution of dissenters through the Act of Toleration issued in 1689. So this is an important act. It's an important date. You'll want to remember the Act of Toleration in 1689. This event ended the persecution of dissenters like Baptists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists. Now, it did leave them in a status of second-class citizenship. The Act of Toleration still endorsed the Church of England, but it did allow dissenting congregations. First of all, they must be Trinitarian. Any Unitarian congregation was considered a heresy and not allowed under any circumstances. But dissenting Trinitarians were allowed to worship if they pledged loyalty to the monarch, which of course had always been their intention. The ministers must assent to the 39 Articles of the Church of England. Now, Baptists would not accept infant baptism or submission to the bishops, and so they only had to assent to 37.5 articles. But here's the rub. They were not allowed to lock their meeting houses, and they were forced to register their places of worship. Now, this concerned them greatly because the dissenters were worried that the act might be repealed, or possibly James might return as king and reestablish persecution, in which case their meeting places were registered and unlocked. So what defense would they have against such possible eventualities? And still dissenters were second-class citizens because in order to hold public office, the office holders still were required to take communion in the Church of England. This is going to lead the Constitution of the United States of America to say that there's no test of religion for public office. The United States would bring about a separation of church and state. And because they'd seen this law misused in England, they said no religious test would be required for public office. Now, you would expect that once persecution ended and toleration was enacted and dissenters now could operate publicly and freely, that there would be tremendous growth among the dissenting churches. But initially, there was tremendous decline. The decline was caused by a number of factors. First of all, there was a moral laxity throughout society as a reaction to the severe Puritanism of earlier decades. The dissenting congregations were preoccupied with consolidation and organization, how to develop their congregations into denominations. There was preoccupation with theological trivia and scholasticism, arguing against other denominations. Among Baptists, there were moves toward anti-Trinitarianism on one side and hyper-Calvinism on the other side. Outside of the church, there were secular attractions that were uh, drawing people away from the church, dramas, gambling. There was intermarrying with other faiths. Once they were free to do business, well, they were successful. That gave them a taste for wealth, and this desire for respectability led them to compromise in their nonconformist principles. And then later on, some of their descendants forgot what those principles were. The good news is that after a few decades of decline, the dissenters were were blessed by God to turn things around and begin to grow again and have a major influence in England and beyond as they began a global missions effort. And so we come to the end of this period of the beginning of English Reformation, the period of time of dissent, and now with the Act of Toleration, we're entering a new era in English Christian life. And next, we're going to back up and move to the north and look at the Scottish Reformation, which happened concurrently with much of what we've talked about in the English Reformation and Dissent. So, next, the Scottish Reformation and John Knox, the Thundering Scot. We'll see you then. Bye-bye for now.